This is Gladys Brown interviewing the Rev Thurber Reuben Thayer on this January 7th, 1980. Rev Thayer's roots go back to the earliest settlers in our area. Rev Thayer, will you tell us something about these ancestors?
In dealing with genealogy and history, I want to first describe my father's side and then my mother's, as both ancestral lines are identified with pioneers and later business activities in the village of Akron and the town of Newstead. All of the Thayers in America are supposed to be descended from the two immigrant brothers, Thomas and Richard. They came from Thornbury Parish, Gloucestershire, in western England, near the Wales border. Thomas came to Braintree, near Boston, Massachusetts, in the early 1630s with his wife and three sons, Thomas, Ferdinando, and Shadrach. My ancestor, Ferdinando, a wealthy and extensive landowner who was given many offices of honor, had 12 children, and in later life moved to Mendon in western Massachusetts. Last fall, while acting as pastor at Jamestown, I met 89-year-old Rev Thayer, who later died of cancer on Christmas Day. As we were both 10th generation descendants of Thomas the immigrant, I discovered that he was my 8th cousin. He had in his possession the book on Thayer genealogy by Bezaleel Thayer, printed at Oswego, New York in 1874, over 100 years ago. I borrowed it for a week and was able to copy some of the material, as it contained the names of over 4,700 Thayers, including my grandfather, Reuben Thayer, and his family. I had previously known some of this material. Back in 1789, when the United States government was being formed, all the area of New York State, west of Seneca Lake, was separated from Montgomery County and named Ontario County. 2 years later, my great-great-grandfather, Reuben Thayer, 6th generation from Thomas, with his wife and several children, migrated from Mendon, Massachusetts, to the new county in western New York. His ancestors living at Mendon had been Captain Thomas, Honorable Thomas, and his father, Peter Thayer, a very large man in stature, weighing about 300 pounds. Reuben settled at Charleston, later called Lima, now in Livingston County, south of the present city of Rochester, and he became a successful land speculator. Instead of building a simple log cabin like many of his neighbors, he erected in 1793 a beautiful frame house with a front doorway called Grecian Revival on a hill overlooking the village from the east. 3 years ago, when I visited this large dairy farm with its millstones by the driveway, and now called Millstone Farm 1793, its present owners, Roger and Marilyn Smith, showed me through the house, some of which was the original building. I parked my travel trailer in their yard overnight, read the Lima history they loaned me, and then was awakened the next morning by the bawling of hungry calves. Reuben's home was the first tavern in that area, and across the road from it, the next year in 1794, was built the first store and post office for Lima. In 1795, Reuben and his first cousin, Gideon Thayer, became charter members of the first religious society organized by any denomination west of Seneca Lake in this state. This was done by Reverend James Thatcher, a Presbyterian, and it was called either a Congregational Society or a Presbyterian Church in the years that followed. In 1796, the first sawmill in that area was built by Reuben Thayer, and from his farm brickyard, whose remains are still visible, came bricks for many of the village houses. Then in 1797, the first town meeting of the area was held at the Thayer Tavern. Adolphus Watkins, a later resident, said he found mostly log houses when he came to Lima. He states, "There was no road going south except one, a mile west of here, leading about a mile and a half, where it stopped. This was Charleston, and then a wilderness. Reuben Thayer built a house here before I came, and it still stands." On the 5th of August, 1799, the 8th and youngest child of Reuben and Abigail Wood Thayer was born at Lima, New York. As the father of our country had died some time before this, he was named George Washington Thayer. He was my great-grandfather, and the alternate names of Reuben and George continued ever since. My own grandfather was Reuben, my father George, my middle name is Reuben, and my son is George. When George Washington Thayer grew up, he married Martha Clemens. So I have a George Washington and Martha in my ancestral line. About 1800, an ambitious young man of Huguenot ancestry by the name of Archibald Smith Clark came from the state of Maryland to the Lima area. He met and married Chloe Thayer, eldest daughter of Reuben, who had been born in Mendon, Massachusetts in 1780. Their first child, Betsy, was born at Lima in October 1803. Their later family consisted of one son and 9 daughters. The very next year, on the 12th of June, 1804, Reuben Thayer died at the age of 57, when little George was not quite 5 years old. Son-in-law Archibald Clark was appointed executor of the estate, and one of his descendants, Miss Mattie Litz of Tonawanda, told me she obtained a copy of the will recorded at Canandaigua, New York, Ontario County seat. In 1802, all of the great area west of the Genesee River in New York State became Genesee County, and it was divided into 4 townships. The largest one by far in size was Batavia, and it included the entire Holland Purchase from Lake Ontario to the Pennsylvania border. As most of the new settlers lived along the Buffalo Road, the first town meeting was held early in 1803 in what was later the Newstead area, as it was a central place between the little settlements at Batavia and Buffalo. Then Batavia Township was divided, and for a few years the name of our town was Willink. At this period of time, in 1805, Archibald and Chloe Thayer Clark came from Lima westward to this area. The next year, 1806, Clark opened the first store in the county outside of Buffalo, near Vanteventer's Tavern, on the main road 1½ miles southwest of the present Akron. Not only did the genial store proprietor do a flourishing business, but because of his legal talent, for over a decade he became the leading office holder of all western New York State. 3 new counties were formed in 1808, namely Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, and Niagara, the latter including the present Erie until 1823. Also in 1808, the town of Clarence came into being in Niagara County and included the present Newstead territory until 1823. Clark was Clarence postmaster 1808 to 11. Then he also represented the 3 new counties as their first state assemblyman from 1808 on. From 1812 to 1816, he served in Albany as this area's first state senator. He also had been the first surrogate judge and a Clarence bank officer. After 1816, he served out General Porter's term as a member of Congress in Washington, D.C. In 1815, when Archibald Clark was Niagara County clerk, his younger brother, Staley Nichols Clark, became his deputy county clerk. The next year, on the 27th of October, 1816, at Clarence, Staley was married to 19-year-old Eunice Thayer, youngest daughter Reuben, and sister of Chloe Clark. Staley worked at the Holland Land Office from 1819 to 1822, and then for about a decade was their land agent in Ellicottville, New York. He was Cattaraugus County Treasurer for 17 years and later represented that district as a representative in Congress. A Cattaraugus County history shows the picture of the Honorable Clark and devotes several pages to his life. He was skillful in business and yet showed great compassion for poor farmers trying to buy land from the company. He had 11 children, and his wife outlived him and died in Pennsylvania at the home of their youngest daughter in 1873. How I wish I knew more about these 2 Thayer sisters, wives of such prominent men. Archibald Clark died in Clarence in 1821 at the early age of 43, nearly 2 years before Erie Township, later called Newstead, was separated from Clarence. At one time, his home had been west of the Ledge Lawn Cemetery, where the flea market is now held. When I first joined the local historical society here in 1971, there was quite a discussion about repairing Clark's broken tombstone, which had been brought from the cemetery to the basement of Dinio Library. It was several years later that I discovered that Clark was my grandfather's uncle, and I should be more concerned about that tombstone. My great-grandfather, George Washington Thayer, farmer and doctor, was married on the 8th of August, 1824, to Martha Clemens, 21-year-old daughter of Francis and Lucinda Moses Clemens. They must have moved to this area soon after, for all 11 children were born here. His older sister, Chloe Clark, now a widow with a large family, was probably still living in this area. Martha's family may also have come here about that time. Her older brother, Artemus Clemens, also married in 1824, and who died in 1879, has a sizable family monument near the road at the southwest corner of Ledge Lawn Cemetery. Another brother married Elizabeth Palmer in 1829, and I found a junk stone on the north side of the cemetery with her name on it as the wife of Colonel Alfred Clemens, and she died in 1858, age 52. Recently, in the microfilmed issue of August 28, 1885, the Akron Breeze, I found the obituary of Colonel Alfred, who died aged 81 at the home of his nephew, Theodore Thayer, in Akron. It was said that he in his early youth had lived here and erected the first frame house in the village of Akron. Sylvanus Thayer, second oldest son of George and Martha, born in 1827, was killed in an accident at the Limerick in 1887. His daughter Celia married Harry Richards, and this family is well known in Akron. The sons, Henry Sylvanus, Jack, and Joseph, were all in business, and the two younger daughters, Mabel and Martha, my second cousins, were in school with me. Mabel is the only one left at this time. My grandfather's, Reuben's younger brother, Theodore, ran a foundry, later carried on by his son Asa. He was mayor of Akron in 1906, 1908, and 1910 to 11, just before he died in 1911. So I was too young to remember him very well. Besides the one Asa, son Asa, who had a son Theodore about my age, there were 6 daughters, 3 of whom had families in this community. Jenny Thayer married Arthur Stapleton, who had a cigar factory at the corner of Main and Monroe Street. He also owned the rink where community events were held. Their twin sons, Arthur and Theodore Stapleton, each had families, and all are well known. So Theodore, Hoover, Jim, and all the others are my second cousins once removed. The Stapletons operated the Oasis store also. Anna Thayer married Charles Dunn, and Harry, one of their 5 children, married Irene Sherwood, who after the death of her father and husband carried on the Sherwood hardware business until just a few years ago. Lila Thayer married Archie Higgins and had 8 children. Dorothy, my age, married the funeral director, Hubert Bernhardt, who is now letting their son Dennis handle most of the business. They took care of the funerals of many of my relatives, including my parents, my wife, and her mother. My grandfather, Reuben R. Thayer, born in 1832, married in 1853 Ella Elvira Havens. Her grandfather, Benjamin, and wife, Penina Whitehead Havens, came to Leroy in the early 1800s. Her father, George Havens, and his brother, Joseph, and 2 sisters came to this area in the 1830s. The Havens Road, which joins the main road opposite Ledge Lawn Cemetery, derived its name from the son of Joseph, George W. Havens, who lived on a farm on it many years. I was confused about this genealogy, for on Joseph's tombstone, his wife Polly's date is different from Polly, wife of Joseph Havens, on the back of the son George W.'s tombstone. Then I discovered that Joseph had been married twice, and both wives were named Polly. George W.'s wife was named Elizabeth, and another Elizabeth was the wife of George Havens, my great-grandfather. Mary, one of the latter's older sisters, married William Jackson, who was Newstead supervisor in 1836. Penina, another of George's sisters, was married to Heman Buell, son of a Newstead pioneer. Heman was the 3rd mayor of Akron, 1851-1852, and a leading citizen, so one of Akron's streets is named Buell. I have seen the tombstones of Heman and his wife beside those of her parents, Benjamin and Penina Havens, in the Buell Cemetery on the main road east of Leroy. Benjamin's youngest son, George, had married Elizabeth Salisbury in 1832 at Leroy before coming here. Her ancestry goes back to immigrant Humphrey Salisbury, who died in Massachusetts in 1708. She was the first white child born in the town of Rose, 2nd of November, 1812. Her father, Milburn, served in the War of 1812. On my trip with my travel trailer 3 years ago, last September, I stayed overnight at the fruit farm home of John Salisbury, whom I discovered was my father's 4th cousin. This was near Phelps, north of Geneva, New York. John's family had hosted Salisbury reunions for many years, and he remembered as a boy the retired newspaper editor who lived there and had published the Salisburian genealogical magazine 60 years ago. I had received 5 copies of this magazine when pastored Salamanca in 1966 from one of my church members, Ruth Sweet, who was also a 4th cousin to my father. And one of these issues was the complete Salisbury Havens line with my name in it. The next day on my trip, as I visited a rural cemetery near Phelps and found side by side the graves and tombstones of my great-grandmother Elizabeth's parents, Milbourne and James Storms. Her grandparents were Stephen and Rhoda Brown Salisbury. In another cemetery nearby was buried the pioneer and Revolutionary War soldier William Salisbury, who in the preceding generation had lived from 1731 to 1821, and his wife's name was Elizabeth Beale, who lived from 1735 to 1817. I've spoken enough about this branch except to say that I'm a 9th generation of the Salisbury line. George and Elizabeth Havens' oldest son was William de Los Havens, and so a brother to my grandmother, Elvira. One of his sons was Eugene Havens, who had a barber shop on Main Street in Akron many years. I remember the shaving mugs and the barber chairs, the little board across for little boys to sit on. There's quite a change from the haircut price, 25 cents for many years, and the present charge of $4 I recently paid in the same shop that only took half the time now with electric clippers. Eugene's son, Rensselaer, and daughter Anna Jean were also second cousins with me in school. She married Glenn Cummings, who became a medical doctor in the Rochester area, but she is now a widow crippled by polio, living at Webster, New York. We have renewed our acquaintance recently in exploring our common Havens ancestry. She told me that her brother was once traveling in Suffolk County, Long Island, and signed a check to pay for gasoline. However, the station attendant wouldn't cash it because he said he knew that Rensselaer Havens was dead and buried at Shelter Island nearby. Sure enough, there was this name on a tombstone. And later Anna Jean was so convinced of this ancestry that she gave her parents' antique furniture to a Havens museum there. But in spite of a recent Havens book on genealogy that she gave me, I haven't found the parents of Benjamin and Penina as yet. Reuben R. Thayer, my grandfather, was a left-handed carpenter who built the house where I now live on Knapp Road over 100 years ago. He also helped to construct the Akron Cement Works and many other buildings in this community. Sometimes he worked in other places, and I have a letter he wrote my father from Pennsylvania in 1891. He begins like this: Mr. George Thayer, dear babe. And instead of closing by saying from father or dad, he merely signs it, yours truly, R. Thayer. At about the time my father was born in 1870, his older brother Elmer, age 16, decided to leave home and seek his fortune. He first married in Michigan and had 2 sons. Then he married again in Washington State and had a daughter. He married the 3rd time in California and had 6 children, only one of which, about my age, is still living. Elmer was quite an inventor, and I remember when I was a small boy, about 1910, when my Uncle Elmer came and stayed here one winter manufacturing woodworking vices in Akron. On my 4th 4-month trip with my brother and wife, after my wife died in 1974, I met 4 of these Thayer first cousins for the first time. One of them, Clarence, was an engineer who had retired as the vice president of Sun Oil Company and entertained us at his beautiful mansion, which he designed. There were 52 doors in it, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. After his retirement, he had headed up his company's great project of getting oil from the tar oil sands in Alberta, Canada. In spite of all his drawings and plans of solving the oil situation, cancer took his life in 1976, age 78 years. My grandfather, Ella Elvira, died here in childbirth with a baby girl when she was only 37 in 1872. My grandfather Reuben was a widower 31 years and died in the bedroom of this house 2 weeks before I was born. Since then, my father died in the same room, January 7, 1936, 44 years ago today. When we first retired here in 1970, my wife had some hesitation about sleeping in that bedroom, but I don't think she knew what was happening when she also died there of a heart attack, September 12, 1974. As my father was only 2 years old when his mother died, he was brought up by 3 older sisters. The eldest, Clara, married Bruce Johnson, whose mother was a sister of Dr. Pennell, prominent in Akron then. According to the Akron Breeze, Mr. Johnson was operating a thriving store on Main Street in the 1880s. Later, when I was very young, I recall visiting my Aunt Clara and enjoying her cracker jar when she lived alone in an apartment above Flint's store, which is now Seisner's Hardware. In 1909, the year before she died, her assistance was given at our home when my brother Frosty was born. He was named Forrest Rev Thayer after the son of a former Free Methodist pastor who later retired and died here in 1958. I still remember staying all night at the home of our neighbor Alfred Knapp as his son Floyd and I were playmates. I was not very pleased when I came home. My aunt came outside and told me I had a baby brother, for I had been the only child for nearly 6 years. My Aunt Clara had 2 daughters, Myrtle and Lula. The latter married Mark Kane, who was a local photographer. He took many of the grade school pictures that I have. There's also one about 1910 of Theodore Thayer with his son and 4 daughters, with some of the grandchildren. Also in it are my father, his brother, and his 2 sisters. Lula Kane contracted tuberculosis, and they moved to Arizona, but she died there in 1918. Her body was shipped east, and the funeral was held at the home of Lila Higgins, Dorothy Bernhardt's mother, on the corner of East Avenue and Liberty. It was my first experience as a teenager in touching a cold corpse. She was the first person in my father's cemetery lot, buried in my father's cemetery lot at Ledge Lawn. The only son, Ezra Kane, was brought up in Perry by his aunt, and in January 1975, on my trip, I stayed a week in his San Antonio, Texas home, where he had retired as an Air Force sergeant. Mark, Ezra's father, lived in California, and he retired and my brother got him in touch with Ezra, so he died there in Texas a few years ago. Jim Stapleton has told me he wished he could have gotten hold of Mark's photographic equipment. My Aunt Hattie married a farmer, Milton Price. They lived on a farm on Bloomingdale, near Akron, when I was small. It was later the Chalgeek farm. We also had to go through the Indian reservation, not so pleasant then at night with no lights on the buggy, when the Prices lived near Bazum on another farm. Later, when they moved to East Pembroke, I enjoyed going there for Thanksgiving as they raised turkeys. Speaking of the Tonawanda Reservation, I'm reminded of a missionary at our church from India who had never seen an American Indian. As a boy, I accompanied her and my mother in the horse and buggy over poor unpaved roads, and we met some Indians at the reservation. At that time, there were no fences, and so cows and pigs went everywhere. In the spring, sometimes on foot, sometimes driving very lean ponies, Indians traveled our roads selling baskets. My mother tells about the time when she was alone with me as a baby, how an intoxicated Indian man walked into the house and insisted on her singing for him. The Milton Prices had 2 children, a son and a daughter, much older than I. However, I do remember when they were married. Laura, the daughter, married Milton Peck and had a bushel of children, that is 4. And so 4 pecks make a bushel. The son, Roy, was a carpenter, and I think it was about 1914 when he and Jacob Moyer built the kitchen wing on our house. The attic above it was high enough in the middle to stand up, and so it made a good playroom for us 2 boys. However, it was necessary to paint a yellow streak down the middle of the room so we would keep our toys separated. World War I had commenced in Europe, and at that period I enjoyed playing with many 6-inch high cardboard soldiers and had them all named with their various ranks. This reminds me of 2 things. We had about half a dozen boys that time, the Moyers, Hilgers, Thayers, and so on, and a little army that drilled with wooden guns. About 30 years ago, when I was pastor at Lockport and became reacquainted with the Hilger family, I remembered this army of which I was a captain, being the oldest boy. William Hilger, who at that time, about 1950, was a big shot, CIO union bargainer with the Harrison Radio Company, told me that he, being the youngest, was the only buck private in my army, all the others being officers of some rank. In grade school, I remember making cartoons and having arguments with a classmate, Paul Teat, who, being of German background, upheld Kaiser William. When I was in 7th grade, which was with the 6th and 8th in a big room with Mr. Madison, father of Harold, as principal, we had a student election for president. We chose Woodrow Wilson, even though he was a Democrat, because he had kept us out of the World War in Europe. The general election later in that year, 1916, did the same. However, we soon were involved in the war, and German sympathizers were ostracized. Even the German language was taken out of many schools. My cousin Roy Price went to France in the infantry. Being mechanically inclined, was given the task of repairing guns and so forth, though being also in combat. I have letters which he sent to my father about his experiences. When he came home, I remember seeing him march in the parades with others. One of the things about his uniform that interested me was the long strip of cloth that he had to wind about his legs to make leggings. Quite a few of our Akron High School students went into the service, and some were killed in the war or died of the flu in camps. School credit was given to students who worked on farms then, and Floyd Knapp told me he probably would not have graduated if it hadn't been for that kind of school credits. There were patriotic loan fund drives during the war, and we boys enjoyed climbing in the tanks that were on exhibition. However, when the armistice was signed in November 1918, everyone was glad to march in the great parade and the celebration in Akron. I still have not quite finished the genealogy of my father's side, but have tried to add stories to make it more interesting. My Aunt Emma Thayer married Charles Enright of Buffalo, who was a socialist, which brought political discussions, as my father was an ardent member of the Prohibition Party. I was surprised to learn recently from the microfilm of the 1880s that my grandfather, Reuben, was also in the Prohibition Party, and many others in Akron, so that elections were won on the local level. Reuben was then an assessor. My father and I would stay all night at my aunt's in Buffalo when I was a boy, and my father had driven the 25 miles to that city with a team and wagon load of potatoes. As a boy in church, I often looked at a motto on the wall which said, "A saloonless nation in 1920. After many states went dry, national prohibition did come in that year. In spite of what some history books say, crime went down and many jails were closed in the earlier periods of prohibition. At that time, the great majority of the population did not use any intoxicating liquor, which is not true today. The great prosperity of the 1920s led to a depression. The head of a brewery was appointed to enforce prohibition, and soon it was thought smart to be a bootlegger and defy the law, and so it was no longer enforced, and the prohibition failed at the polls when the Dries failed to get out the vote. My mother was a lifelong member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, so when I was in high school, they asked me to give an essay against tobacco. It amused some of the judges when I showed them from the Bible that animals that parted the hoof and chewed the cud were considered unclean, and I applied it to those humans who chewed tobacco. About 1933, when I was a young pastor at the village of Ellington, when the first beer garden opened across the street, we were entertaining our district superintendent at our parsonage when a carload of people drove up to our front door and asked us if this was the new beer garden. I disgustedly pointed across the street, but my superintendent had a good laugh. Now back to family again. I officiated at the funerals of both my Uncle Charles Enright in 1937 and my Aunt Emma in 1950 at Bernhardt's. Hubert told me last year about the death of their daughter, my first cousin, Kathleen, and her husband, Dr. Ernest Kramer, in 1976, 1977. As I turn now for a briefer account of my mother's ancestors, I am reminded of the Bible and the way the genealogy of Jesus Christ begins in the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, Revised Standard Version. I quote, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I am also a descendant of Abraham and David, but on the Perkins line and not the Jewish. I am the 10th generation from immigrant Abraham Perkins, who came from England to Hampton, New Hampshire in the 1630s. His son David was a blacksmith who moved to Massachusetts and married Elizabeth Brown, daughter of Francis Brown. A later generation went to Rhode Island. Many other Bible names are found among the Perkins, such as Isaac and Jacob, Joseph and Benjamin, but the most common in my line were the 4th, 5th, and 6th generations of Nathaniel Perkins. The 4th generation, Nathaniel Perkins, married Elizabeth Crandall, and then his son Nathaniel married his 3rd cousin, Mary Crandall. These wives were descendants of the immigrant Baptist minister, Elder John Crandall, who was an associate of Roger Williams in Rhode Island churches. I was given the Crandall line tying in with the Perkins when I was a pastor at Hornell 20 years ago, my Mr. Crandall, the funeral director, and Hornell mayor at that time. The 5th generation Nathaniel, 5 of his brothers and his son, all served in the American Revolution from Rhode Island. The son, after the war, moved into the upper Hudson and Mohawk valleys, where he raised his 9 children. Then he was given a tract of land in Independence Township in Allegheny County, south of Wellsville. There he and his wife came with several of his children and their families in 1824. This Nathaniel Perkins, my great-great-grandfather, was not only a Seventh-day Baptist minister, but also a storekeeper, farmer, and a blacksmith. Sounds like a jack of all trades. His wife, Martha Johnson, lived to be 96, dying during the Civil War. I have seen both of their tombstones in the rural Independence Cemetery beside the former Seventh-day Baptist Church there. Joseph Woodmansey Perkins, son of Nathaniel Jr., was a Methodist local preacher and was married 5 times, and by 2 of them he had 9 children. His first wife, Harriet Draper, died in 1834 at the age of 38. She and her husband, who died in 1870, are buried in Stratford, Herkimer County, on the edge of the Adirondack Mountains. Her ancestral line goes back to James Draper, the Puritan immigrant, who came from England to Massachusetts in the 1630s. So here again, I'm a 10th generation descendant. I did not know until I got this Draper genealogy from John Hart that Harriet's parents, my great-great-grandparents, had migrated to Newstead in the 1830s and are buried at Eldred Cemetery about east of Hunt's Corners. There is a 3-generation monument in that cemetery, beginning with Gideon and Jairus as the first, then Ahimaaz and Lorenda the second, and 8 children of the 3rd generation, 2 of whom I remember, Laura and Hiram, as old-time Free Methodists living the corner of Draper Road and Hunt's Corners Road. Ahimaaz and his son Micah were very prominent in their local church, often going to conferences as Akron's lay delegates. Micah's daughter, Carrie, married William Blacklock, and their youngest daughter, Stella McVean, my 3rd cousin, is the last of that generation. Ephraim Vale's wife, Lillian Draper, another 3rd cousin, was daughter of Gideon, Micah's son. My mother's father, Wesley Orrin Carmi Perkins, son of Joseph W. and Harriet Draper, came to this area in 1849 as a young man of 19. He married his 2nd cousin, Clarissa Smith, and had 5 children, only 2 of whom grew up. She was a granddaughter of David Draper, brother of Gideon, who died about the same time, 1850, and was also buried at Eldred Cemetery with a marker. Clarissa was an active Free Methodist church member, as well as her mother, and at the time of her early death in 1866, age 32, the map of Akron shows W.O.C. Perkins owning 4 pieces of property on Main Street, Monroe Street, Clinton Street, and Brooklyn Street. In 1851, the year after Clarissa married W.O.C. Perkins, her mother, Sarah, a widow, married Joseph Gammon, a widower, with 5 small children. Joseph's first wife, Mary Ann Dolph, who died in 1850, was the daughter of John and Sarah Dilly Dolph, who had come from Lucerne County, Pennsylvania. He was the pioneer mentioned on the sign in the Akron Falls Park a few years ago, beside the Indian clan emblems. That sign stated he had found an Indian maiden mourning at the grave of her fiancé, who was murdered by a white man, and this was one reason for the naming of Murder Creek. There was also an Aaron Dolph who came here earlier and purchased land in 1805. He may have been an older brother or father, for John Dolph was 21 years old at that time. In 1867, W.O.C. Perkins married his second wife, Sarah Gammon, his first wife's stepsister, who had now grown up, and they had 6 children. The first 2 were boys and died in infancy. The next 4 were girls, my mother Nellie being the oldest. Her sister Belle married Charles Houskinick and moved to Batavia, where now their son Harmon and his 2 sons operate a large garage, Houskinick Motors. Lily married Irving Kuhn, who went from here to Batavia, had 5 children, died of tuberculosis in California, 1919. Myrtle, the youngest, married 3 times but had no children, died in California 2 years ago at the age of 97 and a half. My mother, Nellie Zelona Perkins, was born in 1871 on the Hunts Corners Road, lived there until she was 12 years old. Then in 1883, the Wesley Perkins family moved into Akron, and he built a store on Monroe Street. Nellie's sister Myrtle, then a little girl, told me when I saw her in California in 1974 that she remembers having candy from the store to share with her playmates. My mother was appreciative of a better school and church privileges in Akron. But Wesley Perkins died in January 1885, age 54. Then later in September of that same year, Mrs. Perkins's stepmother, Sarah, and her father, Joseph Gammon, also died only 2 weeks apart at the Perkins home. In the fall of 1888, my mother went to Chili Seminary to do high school work and earned her way by her teaching in the grades. But after 10 weeks, she had to return home to help support the family by doing housework or teaching in rural schools. She kept a diary from 1890 through 1893 and mentions the weather and what she did each day. August 16, 1890, she writes, did housework and took care of Liam when his mother, Mrs. Paxson, went to Ontario Beach. This Liam was the father of Judge Paxson. When my mother taught 2 terms of school at Benedict's Bridge, 5 miles north of Akron, January to June 1889, the snow was so deep some of the older boys had to carry her to the schoolhouse. In the spring of 1892, she taught at Mansfield Corners, Clarence. She graduated from Akron High School in 1892 in a class of 6. The names of her classmates were Dennis Nolan, Nellie Hoig, Grace Churchill, Carrie Bates, and Emma Parks. They are in the middle of the picture, the upperclassmen of 1892, shown in the Akron Centennial book printed in 1949. My grandmother, Sarah Gammon Perkins, died at the age of 45 in September of 1892. My mother had to comfort the younger sisters. Mary Ann Perkins, Sarah's younger sister, lived with them, never married, and so kept house for the family. My mother taught school 2 miles south of Lancaster that year. She also started keeping company with my father, George Thayer, a farmer, and he would meet her train at Crittenden when she came home sometimes on weekends. They were married in July 1893. For the next 10 years, lived on various farms in the same neighborhood. After a few months of being a farmer's wife, my mother was too busy to write in her diary anymore. My mother joined the Akron Free Methodist Church in 1886, so was a member over 60 years when she died in 1957. My father joined the same church in 1890 and was very active as a trustee, lay delegate, and so forth until his death in 1936. We were so faithful in attendance as a family. When we drove to town, our horses would start to turn in the church driveway when we went on Albert Street, now Parkway Drive. Perhaps the reason was more practical than religious. as the sheds in the back of the church were better protection from rain and snow than standing at a hitching post in the business section downtown. Dennis Nolan grew up near the Five Corners and attended the Falkirk District School there with my father, who did not go farther than the 8th grade in school. Dennis went on to West Point and reached the rank of Major General when he was head of the Intelligence Department in World War I. I recall as a little boy going to a birthday party for Dennis' son. And it was interesting for me recently to look at and identify the Falkirk children in the picture. I have, such as Hannah and George Summers, 3 Tesnos, Joe Dargan, later a doctor. What I remember best was that Colonel Nolan and his wife walked me home that night 1/2 mile in the dark. My mother's high school class formerly had reunions also. The 1 boy and 5 girls went for a drive with a horse in Surrey. I always attended school in Akron, though the old schoolhouse was still standing at Five Corners when I was very young. My 1st grade teacher was Grace Earle, and my 3rd grade teacher was Emma Parks, both close friends of my mother's. The kids laughed at me when I called her Aunt Emma in school. When she died as the last of her family in 1941, my mother was the executor of her estate, staying in her house on Crittenden Road and selling her possessions. Frankie Weidler, my 5th grade teacher, who lived at the foot of John Street, had also been my father's teacher years before. She had unique methods of discipline. She could accurately throw a piece of chalk or eraser and hit the mouth or other offending part of the pupil's anatomy. Her favorite punishment for the boys was to have them bend over and put a finger on a crack in the floor, then swat their rear when the pants were tight. That surely hurt. When no one was late to school for a week in her room, we got out a half hour early. Pupils would even stay home rather than come late until we got off a half day entirely. In high school, the one teacher I remember best was Miss Gertrude Leopold, who was vice principal under Victor Boyd, but later principal herself in the new school built on Bloomingdale when I was in college. As there were horse sheds, some with doors that could be locked, back of the Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian churches, some of the country students drove to school with horses and buggies and parked them in the sheds during school hours. These sheds extended from back of the Methodist church, which was smaller then, almost to the present barn back of Bernhardt's funeral home. There were 2 rows of sheds back to back for Methodists and Baptists, each stall large enough for a horse and carriage. East of them were the sheds of the former Presbyterian church, which stood on what is now the Baptist parking lot. Between them and the 2 school buildings, which were closer to John Street than now, was the school playground for all ages. The high school building later became the Masonic Temple, which burned in the early 1960s, and the new Masonic Temple is farther back from John Street. When I was in the middle grades at Akron Grammar School, located where the Newstead Town Hall now stands, those of us who came over a mile to school took our lunches. We ate in the park across the street in good weather, spring and fall, but the rest of the year went down in the school basement near the furnaces. Sometimes there was a strong smell when Italians from Bloomingdale brought bread with garlic. Also, some of us in the early fall and late spring would go swimming during the noon hour. Carrying our lunches and eating on the way, we crossed Main Street by the present post office, then went between the houses and down the sandbank to Murder Creek. Then we completely disrobed and enjoyed what was called the baby swimming hole, as it was just deep enough to swim in. I don't remember that any girls ever came to bother us. We did realize that our classmate Russell Blue Eye was an Indian because his darker skin was more noticeable when we were all together in the water naked. At other occasions than the school noon hour, when we had more time, we went in swimming at Jebbs's, which was deeper. This was located down the bank from the present tennis courts and is covered by the lake now. Sometimes the older high school boys would carry us out into the deep water or dunk us, so we tried to avoid being there with them. Of course, all of us were in the nude, and I don't remember owning a swimming suit until along in my teens when we went to some public place or Lake Ontario to swim. Our Free Methodist Church had immersion baptismal services at Jebbs's swimming hole, and I was baptized there when I was about 13. It was not a thrill for me, but rather an embarrassment. The pastor, Reverend J.F. Franklin, who had 2 sons about my age, was very slow-spoken. He was reciting the ceremony as I stood beside him in the water. When I thought he was going to put me under, I started holding my breath. But it took him so long that when he did dunk me, I had let out my breath and came up with a nose full of water and choking. Perhaps that is one reason why I am not so keen about immersion as a mode of baptism, though I have since attended many of these services. My dad had never attended church very much until near the time he was converted, as a young man of 20. He often told how they cut a hole in the ice of Murder Creek to immerse him, and he never caught cold. Our church accepts all 3 types of baptism, and even at the time when I was immersed, some of the girls in our age group stood on the water's edge and water was poured over them. According to a recent religious film seen on TV, John the Baptist used that mode in Christ's day. After a hard day's work on the farm, I often went with others to a swimming hole back of where the Peanut Railroad water tank formerly stood, about a quarter of a mile east of where Crittenden Road crosses Murder Creek. For a number of years, the various branches of a big tree, which had fallen across the creek, gave us plenty of diving boards. It was also a good place for boys to fish as for bass, sunfish, and bullheads. When I grew older, we swam in the 20-foot deep pool below the lower Akron Falls and could jump or dive from the various ledges as little water was going over then. My brother was more of a daredevil than I, and would jump off from the high tree branches there and also at Indian Falls on the Tonawanda Creek. Now back to describe school again. We had spell downs in the lower grades, and I always did well in them. I liked to read and was able to read most of the books then in each school library. The 6th, 7th, and 8th grades were all together in a big study hall upstairs and had classes in 3 or 4 of the other rooms. One time I got so interested in reading a library book, I forgot to go to class. In 8th grade, as we had passed most of our regents in the elementary subjects, we were allowed to take algebra and elementary design to get some high school credits. We had a good teacher, but only about half a dozen passed the algebra regents. Some of these went on and finished high school in 3 years. One of these was Hannah Summers Bitterman. But as I did not yet have English 4 at the end of my junior year, though I had enough credits to graduate then, I went through the 4th year and received a special diploma of 5 years credits. That senior year I took shorthand and bookkeeping, as that was about all the subjects left being taught at our school. So I graduated in 1922 in a service at the rink and received a $20 gold piece for highest average in the class. My parents also gave me a $10 gold piece, both of which I used for college expenses. If I could have kept them, I wonder how much they would be worth today, with the price of gold over $600 an ounce. Our high school classes then didn't splatter their numbers around with paint, as it is common today, but we did have rivalry over securing another class banner. Also, there were class yells, such as never late, 1918, on time, 1919, never slow, 1920, just begun, 1921. I was not able to enter into athletic sports during high school, as I had chores to do at home and other work on the farm after school. However, I did go to some basketball games, which were held in the rink after the seats were piled up on one side of the room.
Well, Reverend Thayer, you've done a beautiful job of putting together a lot of basic facts here and family history. Now I'm going to ask you some questions just off the cuff. I'm curious about all those stone fences that are out on Knapp Road where you live.
The stone wall fences were built all around our farm, and also fields were set off, one from another, 3, 4, 5 acre fields on our farm and on the farm where my brother now lives when we first bought that. And they finally became so old and would fall down because of getting woodchucks in them, and they didn't keep the cows out, that we allowed them to be taken away. Also, we were kept filling them up with stones we picked up and making them so wide they took up so much land. But I remember how even when I was growing up, that stone wall fences were being built, even though what I had known were built when my father was only 4 feet high as a little boy. But between our place and the Five Corners, between the Five Corners and on the Indian Falls Road and on the Knapp Road, on the Scotland Road, when I was a little boy, there were 2 men, Sheldon Weatherby, the father of Alfred, and Jim Taylor, father of Nace, were senior citizens then, or Civil War vets over 65, had the job of building these fences. Stones were drawn, and they received $1 apiece a rod, I think, and they would do a rod or 2 a day in laying up these fences as they visited one with another. And so that's how those fences were built. They also have been taken down too at this time. My father used to say he got so tired of picking up stone, for we would draw them down and dump them off at both farms, and then we'd pick them up with forks and a wagon when we'd plant the wheat. Sometimes we had to dynamite them out of the ground because they got in the way. It seemed like every year after we plowed, there were always stones coming up as if they grew up. And so it was a continual job. Nowadays, and the people who plant the corn on my property no longer plow because they find that they have to pick up stone afterward. So they just go through and plant and put fertilizer and seed in the ground and spray for the weeds and come in the fall and harvest the corn. Don't have to plow anymore.
Reverend Thayer, do you remember when the Chautauquas would come to town in the summer?
Yes, we had a big tent put up at the head of John Street where the baseball diamond used to be, Forrestal's home side now. And at that time, we would have noted speakers come and speak at a place like that. For instance, I think I heard William Jennings Bryan there one time. Then, as a little boy, I wasn't allowed to go to the movies, and they weren't too common, really, when I was small. I think I saw my first moving picture in one of those places when they had a film of some type of thing at the time. And other speakers would come and speak, and it was a kind of a gala time in the summer at these Chautauqua. Later, they had lyceum courses in the schools that were somewhat similar with entertainers and musicals and things of that sort. I remember another thing at the school grounds where they had a big high ladder and a man would jump off into a big tub of water. And he also had a little dog, and he coaxed the little dog to go up the steps, and the dog would jump off in the water. But I heard that later on, one time when he went off from this diving board way up in the air, 60, 80 feet, that the wind blew and he didn't hit the big tub of water and was killed.
You mentioned beans as a cash crop when you were young. Were there others?
Yes, we didn't have a dairy because our land was not good for pasture, and so potatoes was our main crop. In fact, my father was known as Potato George. We raised from 5 to 10 acres every year, and I handled hundreds and thousands of bushels of growing up. And later the year when I stayed out after high school, I stayed home a year before I went to college to help my father. And in the fall, when we dug potatoes, sometimes we had a few adult men to pick up potatoes, and one man could pick up maybe 100 bushel a day. But we often depended on school kids to come up after school. And my father would dig quite a few rows, and the boys would rush up there, sometimes even girls, and I would let them have crates to pick in, bushel crates, 2 to a crate, and give them each 2 a different colored little piece of pasteboard to put in the crate so I could identify them. And then when I collected them in the wagon, I paid them off at 3-4 cents a bushel, and they'd earn 25 to 50 cents picking up potatoes. I remember that about that time, we had physical education, a new thing in our school. We had a lady physical education director, and she came up with the boys and was going to pick up potatoes, and she did it. But she must have used different muscles than she had used at school, because for the next few days she could hardly conduct the calisthenics classes that they had. My father used to think if we could sell the potatoes at the field, unsorted, at $1 a bushel, we could make good. But sometimes we only got 50 cents. And then we'd have to take them to dump them in the basement of the barn. We'd fill up our bins down in the cellar, and we had our bins up high because water came in the cellar. And so picking potatoes was quite a job. In the spring, it always seemed a shame when we had to plant 100 bushel of potatoes when the potatoes were high priced, and yet we had to in order to get a crop. My father used to cut them for seed by hand, and I can see him yet as he rode on the wagon from our place to where my brother now lives, a mile, cutting up with a paring knife these potatoes. But then we found a little bit of a contraption that you put a potato in and cut it in 4 to 6 pieces. Of course, all the pieces didn't have eyes on, didn't always come up, but it helped a lot in cutting up 100 bushel of potatoes. Another crop that we had was peas, but they had to be very carefully done at a certain time or they would get hard. But we would draw loads of peas down through town, down even Main Street, to go over to Jackson Street where the canning factory was. And it was very tempting for children to run out behind the load and again pull the vines out. It wasn't too bad if they weren't greedy, but when they did get too many, my dad had a way of discouraging them by flashing a big whip over the back of the load. But peas were an interesting crop at that time. And then there was also, of course, drawing hay. We had to have hay for feed, and we didn't have the modern type of things. We had a mower to cut the hay, but we had to rake it up, and the rake was just a one-wheel, one-horse outfit, and it would dump the hay in windrows, and then we had to pitch it onto the wagon because we didn't have a hay loader, and we had to pitch it off. But we did have a hay fork or grab fork or harpoon to take it off in bunches up into the barn and over into the haymow. But sometimes we sold hay to people in Akron, and I remember helping to pitch off a load of hay at Corbett's up over in their barn when they still had horses to deliver their lumber, and other places around town. It was a lot of work to pitch hay through the summertime. On the farm, we had chores to do. I took care of the horses. There were generally 4 of them, curried them, cleaned out stables, and we had to carry straw in to bed them. My father took care of the few cows we had and calves, and and then we had pigs. I did hate butchering, but we had to butcher, and we didn't have refrigeration, and we put the meat in crocks in the cellar to keep it through the winter. We had chickens,